This episode of The Dig, like every episode of The Dig, is produced in partnership with Jacobin Magazine. Jacobin is an incredible publication, and you've probably seen a lot of what they've published online. But they also have a really beautiful print magazine. It comes out quarterly and has well over 100 pages packed with illustrations, infographics, and some of the best graphic design in the country. Dig listeners can join 50,000 Jacobin subscribers developing socialist political thought and debate for just $15 a year. $15 gets you an entire year of Jacobin in print and access to the magazine's entire back catalog. If you've never subscribed to Jacobin before, you can access this deal by going to bit.ly/digjacobin. All lowercase. That's bit.ly/digjacobin. bit.ly/digjacobin. All lowercase. Welcome to The Dig, a podcast from Jacobin Magazine. My name is Daniel Denver, and I'm broadcasting from Providence, Rhode Island. It is obvious that certain prevailing norms around identity that pervade corners of left activist politics, liberal establishment posturing, academia, nonprofits, and corporate America are damaging. All politics, of course, are in important ways about identity, including the making of the English working class and, more recently, the making of a MAGA fanatic. But the term has strayed far from what the Combahee River Collective, the group that coined it, meant in 1977. As I discussed 3 years ago with Kienga Yamada-Taylor, for Combahee, the concept was a way to identify how capitalism, racism, patriarchy, and homophobia created a set of interlocking oppressions. The point of identifying how those systems operated together was not to create an itemized politics of particularity, but rather to create a framework for solidarity. Today, the term identity politics has so often come to stand in for a politics that focuses on language and the balance of power within elite spaces, much more so than the concrete issues facing oppressed people and how we on the left might organize to build power and win. Indeed, it is a politics that often obscures how power and domination actually operate. Yet, of course, far too often critiques of identity politics as currently practiced inhabit a funhouse mirror of their ID poll opponents. You have likely noticed that a major project of this podcast is to navigate between various reductive poles of this debate, evading the superficiality of a certain brand of identitarianism while remaining clear-eyed about the foundational role that racism and sexism play in American capitalism, empire, and the security state. It is in that spirit that I am very happy to share with you this interview with Femi Táíwò, a philosopher who recently authored an essay entitled Being in the Room Privilege, Elite Capture and Epistemic Deference, published in The Philosopher. The article is about standpoint epistemology, the powerful insight that knowledge is socially situated and so that oppressed people know something particular about their lives and conditions. More specifically, it's about how standpoint epistemology is instead put into practice as what Táíwò calls deference epistemology. He writes, quote, "Broadly, the norms of putting standpoint epistemology into practice call for practices of deference, giving offerings, passing the mic, believing. These are good ideas in many cases, and the norms that ask us to be ready to do them stem from admirable motivations. A desire to increase the social power of marginalized people identified as sources of knowledge and rightful targets of deferential behavior. But deferring in this way as a rule, or default political orientation, can actually work counter to marginalized groups' interests, especially in elite spaces. Táíwò compellingly argues that the norms of deference epistemology empower elites vis-a-vis oppressed people, undermine the left's political efficacy, infantilize people of color as romantic caricatures rather than engaging them as comrades, and turn white leftists into political cowards. Quote, "The call to listen to the most affected, or center the most marginalized, is ubiquitous in many academic and activist circles. But it's never sat well with me. In my experience, when people say they need to listen to the most affected, it isn't because they intend to set up Skype calls to refugee camps or to collaborate with houseless people. Instead, it has more often meant handing conversational authority and attentional goods to those who most snugly fit into the social categories associated with these ills, regardless of what they actually do or do not know, or what they have or have not personally experienced." This essay is among the most lucid, powerful, and important that I have read in a while. I will include a link in the show notes, and I encourage you to read it, and read it twice if you have the time. It's only 7 pages, but every sentence contains multitudes. Okay, before we get started, this podcast only exists most every week free of charge to all, regardless of your ability to pay, because those of you who can contribute do so at patreon.com/thedig. Looking back, it is pretty amazing that this all works. This Sunday, the 6th of December, is the Dig's 4-year anniversary. I started the podcast with my producer, Alex Lewis, just after I had been mercifully laid off from Salon.com. I had not enjoyed my time writing hot takes on tight deadlines. But I also had no clue what I was going to do with myself. My dream job at the Philadelphia City paper was behind me. I had followed my partner to Providence, Rhode Island, and so quit that job. And anyhow, the city paper shut down soon after I left. I had loved local alt weekly reporting and investigative journalism, but that industry was and remains in a death spiral. I had long wanted to better connect the intellectual and activist left in this country, two groups alienated from one another thanks to the professionalization of intelligentsia, the decline of organized socialist groups, and plain old American anti-intellectualism. And I, for some reason, thought that a podcast would be a good way to do that. I started the Dig not knowing that it could become my full-time job, and really not knowing what I was doing, which is something that you will probably pick up on if you listen to early episodes. Today, however, I am really proud of the podcast that we've put together over the past 4 years. I'm really grateful for all the notes I've received that let me know the critical role that the Dig has played in transforming your political analysis from liberal to socialist, or just keeping you up on the latest radical scholarship, a podcast that you listen to while washing dishes, cleaning hotel rooms, commuting to work, taking a run, or delivering the mail. Anyhow, please consider celebrating our 4-year anniversary by making a contribution at patreon.com/thedig. That's patreon.com/thedig. And also, please consider encouraging your friends to check out the show, including by posting something on why you listen to this podcast, what the Dig means to you, on Twitter or Facebook or Instagram or wherever. Thank you for your support. Thank you for publicly celebrating the Dig's 4-year anniversary. Okay, here's Femi Táíwò, a professor of philosophy at Georgetown University. His work focuses on social and political philosophy, with an emphasis on anti-colonial thought and the Black radical tradition. Femi Táíwò, welcome to the Dig.
Thank you.
You open your essay reflecting upon an email you received from a freelance journalist who offered to pass along a story idea of hers to you. She wrote, quote, "I abandoned the pitch because I don't think I'm the right person to write this story. I have no idea what it's like to be Black." It's on one level the most ordinary sort of interaction these days, but scratching just a little bit below the surface, it proves to be a lot more complex. What it's like to be Black. Those words, upon closer inspection, contain multitudes. What did she mean by what it's like to be Black? And then what did it mean to you? What was her implicit understanding of what you have in common with Black people in general? And how in that interaction did that understanding misfire?
We talked for a while after this. So, I got the strong impression that, she's someone who's extremely thoughtful about these issues. She's not someone who's just kind of thoughtlessly imitating things she's heard at organizing spaces, but she thinks deeply about, what these kinds of interactions are about and how they should go. And what she was talking about, which some of the details of which come out later in the essay, she was talking about a story idea that involved thinking about the environmental consequences of policy decisions. So the kinds of discussions that are going on under the heading of environmental racism. So I think the kind of person she was imagining, given the story idea, was the sort of person who's Black, who grew up in a red line community, who grew up near environmental toxins, where that was a result of living in that kind of community and the way that those kind of communities are preyed upon by titans of industry. So there were a number of things going on, right? She was making one kind of claim that seemed to be about knowledge, or she had one sort of suspicion that seemed to be about knowledge, right? If I tried to do this story, I might not get the details right. I might not really understand what's properly at stake. I might misrepresent the issue. But she also, I think, had another set of thoughts that often get run together with those first thoughts, but that are actually different. She was thinking about, when we write stories, we get paid, we get credit for doing these sorts of things, right? We get our name out there as writers, in her case, as a journalist. Part of the thought that she had was, even supposing I could get it right, is it my place? Am I the right person to tell this story from a moral perspective, even kind of irrespective of the question of whether or not I could get the right story? I could represent what's happening in these kind of communities in the right way. And so Helen, I think, as I said before, thought deeply about these things and thought that the right thing to do on some understanding of right was to pass along the story idea to someone who was better situated in one, or ideally both, of those respects to tell the story that she was thinking about.
Why did her understanding of how you related to what it's like to be Black, how did that misfire?
Yeah, so I thought, the way that she identified what the right person would be to tell the story and to figure out what the story should be and how it should be told was in identity terms. She wanted someone who was from the right racial identity group to have this story. And we could tell the story of why she identified the group in a number of ways. Maybe she just trusts people from that group to know whether or not they have the relevant experience. Maybe she takes being in that group, the right kind of racial identity group, to come alongside having the right kind of experience. Or maybe she just thinks those people should decide what's relevant in the first place. And so maybe it's just kind of a moral argument all the way down. What's important for what the piece is about isn't ascribing Helen a particular view. As I said, and as I found out in talking to her, she actually had and has deep thoughts about all of these things. But what I took her to be doing in that situation was following a norm. So there's a way of navigating those circumstances. There's kind of rites and rituals. There's prescribed actions. There's symbolic things that we do in situations like this that we might do for a bunch of reasons. We might do because we, reflectively think they're the thing to do. We might do because we think we don't have a better answer than the people around us, and that's what they're doing. We might do because we fear the consequences of not doing them. And what I took Helen to be doing was acting on the basis of a norm, acting on the basis of a kind of pattern of ways that people respond to issues like this in the journalism world, and I think a fair bit beyond the journalism world, in a lot of activism and academia and culture, quite a bit more general than those aspects of culture.
In this story, you identify an equivalence drawn between you, a Nigerian American, and a Black American, at least implicitly, a Black American who is a descendant of enslaved Africans whose family, for example, arrived in, say, a deindustrializing Chicago during the Great Migration and then attended underfunded all-Black schools in a neighborhood where poverty was concentrated by legal and extra-legal forces of segregation, and where young men excluded from the labor market were targeted for repression by the carceral state. Did her presumption of this equivalence, and I'm not beating up on her, as you say, these are norms that I think that's probably clear to most listeners, that these are powerful norms. Does this sort of presumption obscure the way that racism, along with other forms of domination and exploitation, actually operate?
Yeah, I think the norm that she was following leads to that consequence. The way that leads to that consequence isn't necessarily because of the ways that we think about each other. I actually doubt that Helen, really thought that my experience was equivalent to the experience of someone from a working class African American neighborhood who was themselves working class and African American, and descended from generations of people who had been enslaved in this country. I take Helen to be the kind of person who could probably hang in a conversation that was exploring those kinds of complications. But what's interesting about the norms that we're called to follow in these circumstances are that they actually block those things from discussion. They obscure those things, and they, more importantly, call us to treat each other in ways that don't attend to those kinds of differences.
Before we get any further, let's define standpoint epistemology in theory. You cite this definition. Quote, 1, knowledge is socially situated. 2, marginalized people have some positional advantages in gaining some forms of knowledge. 3, research programs ought to reflect these facts. That all seems pretty straightforward and really unimpeachable. But in practice, you write, what we often see instead is what you call deference epistemology. Explain that distinction that you're drawing.
Yeah, so standpoint epistemology is a perspective on knowledge. It's a perspective on how we get knowledge, and to some extent, it's a perspective on how we should get knowledge. So number 3 of the list that you just read says that research programs ought to reflect the facts that knowledge is socially situated and that marginalized people have some positional advantages in getting some forms of knowledge, right? But deference epistemology is more like number 3 than more like 1 and 2. So if you stare at number 3, research programs ought to reflect these facts about how knowledge is situated and who gets what kinds of knowledge. It doesn't tell you how, in and of itself. And there's been a lot of discussion by the standpoint epistemologists of many different areas of thought and practice, some of which are academic and some of which are not. The kind of origin of standpoint epistemology was in a Hungarian Marxist philosopher, Lukács. That standpoint epistemology was firmly about the difference that class position makes to what one can know and what perspective one has. And feminists built on that foundation and came to some additional conclusions, learned more about the kinds of positions that matter.
In the context of women's liberation movement consciousness raising.
Exactly. Yeah, in the context of a political project that was challenging patriarchy and not just, particular claims to knowledge or particular claims about what the world was like. And so deference epistemology is different from standpoint epistemology as a theory, in that deference epistemology, as I characterize it, is just a particular way of living out standpoint epistemology. Or you could say a particular way of answering the question, how should we do number 3? How should research programs or anything else that we do reflect the facts that we started with? The facts that knowledge is socially situated and that marginalized people have some advantages. What should we do in light of those facts? Deference epistemology is one kind of answer. And the point of what I was saying was we shouldn't run that together with what we started with. Deference epistemology is one kind of answer, but we could answer that question about what to do in another way. And I think that different way, which I call constructive epistemology, is actually a better way of living out what standpoint epistemology is about.
It's become so identified with certain sides of these identity debates that we're always enmeshed in, but you could trace standpoint epistemology all the way back to Marx, who certainly believed that knowledge was socially situated.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that core thought that who you are has impacts on what you know, that's a very old thought in many traditions of philosophy, many intellectual traditions, many political traditions. And I think the attention to that has been brought up by standpoint epistemology, whether in the feminist tradition or in the Marxist tradition or in the Marxist feminist tradition or in any other tradition. I think paying attention to that fact is extremely important. And, we owe the people who have done the work to make that apparent to us. We owe them a lot. But one of the things we owe them is, I think, living out standpoint epistemology in a way that is progressive, is good, that moves the world forward rather than backward.
You write, quote, "The trap wasn't that standpoint epistemology was affecting the conversation, but how. Broadly, the norms of putting standpoint epistemology into practice call for practices of deference, giving offerings, passing the mic, believing." And you add that these are norms that are typically enacted within rooms occupied by elites. And though I'm sure these practices of deference are abundantly familiar to anyone listening, I'd like you to explain how they operate and also how and why it is that this framework so often locates questions of justice in the realm of conversation, discourse, recognition, representation.
So the conversation with Helen that the piece starts with is a good example of the kind of thing that I had in mind. So in that case, you could think of it as an occasion of passing the mic, right? Helen has an idea about a story that she thinks ought to be told. She thinks that story would be good. It would be helpful for the kind of people who are facing problems of environmental racism. But she worries about whether or not she's the right person to tell it, given her understanding of the norms that people are going to use to evaluate her and her own understanding of what she takes to be at stake with the norms, right? And so she passes the mic. She says, "I'm not the right person to tell this story. I'm looking for someone who is the right person to tell this story because I think it's worth being told." And she gets in a conversation with me, and I fit enough of the characteristics of what that person should be like, given my racial identity. And she says, maybe you should tell this story rather than me. And so the both of us are people from, on a national scale, on a global scale, I think very privileged backgrounds compared to much of the people that live on this earth. It's that fact in and of itself helps to explain why we were in touch, and it helps explain how our interaction went when it's combined with these norms that I'm calling deference epistemology.
Does it also explain the emphasis on discourse and language?
I think it does. So the emphasis on discourse and language, to me, fits broadly with this phenomenon called elite capture that I've been thinking about. There was another piece that I wrote on elite capture. And in that one, I thought about a distinction between elites and the rest of their group, whatever their group might be. And I thought, one thing that's typically true of elites of a group is that they have simpler social problems than the rest of that group. And I can put that in really visceral terms as a Nigerian American, right? There are millions upon millions of Nigerians who face much different and I think much graver problems than I do with respect to housing security, with respect to police violence. Afrobarometer put out a report saying that something like 3/4 of all Nigerians who had interacted with police in any way, shape, or form reported being extorted for money. And these are not problems that are characteristic of my life, yet I am likelier than most Nigerians to be in the elite spaces where Nigerian issues might come up, whether it's the African Studies Department at Georgetown University, or whether it's a panel being held by a DC think tank, so on and so forth. Because of where I am, because of what prestige I have, because of my privileges of various kinds. And so in these spaces, I could have different kinds of priorities. Maybe what's important to me is changing the actual structure of policing, changing the material structures of the global economy and the Nigerian economy such that people don't face those kinds of problems. But my experiences of those issues are much different than most Nigerians. I'm housing secure. I have income security. I'm a salaried employee. And so the thing about me that overlaps with what Nigerians experience might be the reputation of Nigeria, might be the presence or prestige given to figures, intellectual figures from that background, or maybe even activists from that background. And so, discourse might tap into those kinds of questions. Conversation might tap into those kinds of questions that I do have in common with the rest of the group, but it might not meet the same kinds of priorities that the full group would have. So it might be more important to me than someone who's housing insecure. It might be more important to me than someone who faces a particularly extortive kind of policing that the students in Georgetown University read the kind of texts that Nigerians have produced. So it's a question of priorities, I think.
You write, quote, access to these rooms is itself a kind of social advantage, and one often gained through some prior social advantage. They are most likely to be in the room precisely because of the ways in which they are systematically different from, and thus potentially unrepresentative of, the very people they are then asked to represent in the room. Are the two things related? In other words, does the very emphasis on the balance of power within the room, can that serve to obscure the much larger balance of power, imbalance of power between the room and the rest of the world?
I think that's exactly how it functions. I think the focus on what's going on in the room, who's being listened to in the room, obscures the broader social questions that we might ask if we were thinking equivalently about the people who aren't in the room. And the story about selection, the story about how I got into the room, I think helps explain why. One, it helps explain why my interests are different from the interests of the average person who isn't in the room. And two, I think it helps explain why the kinds of things I will say and the kinds of things that matter to me and the kinds of things I will push for as a result of being empowered within the room are not of any necessary relationship to the larger group dynamics that are the supposed reason for empowering my viewpoint. So just to give an example, because that's a little bit abstract. So racial justice is an easy example. So the very things that put me in the room where racial justice is the thing to talk about might explain why when I talk about racial justice, I talk about the sorts of things that are of a concern to the sorts of people who could make it into fancy panels and so on and so forth, rather than the kinds of issues I mentioned before, rather than housing insecurity, rather than police extortion, rather than various kinds of intimate partner violence even. I have the kinds of resources that can let me navigate those problems in a much different way than other people. It doesn't make me immune to those problems, but I have a different relationship to them than other people.
There's this really tired debate, of course, that pits race against class or various forms of identity against class, but your essay makes it so clear that racism is obviously an incredibly powerful force, but it has various manifestations, and the variety of those manifestations are profoundly material.
I think that's right. I'm not even sure what it would mean to pit race versus class, especially on the view of the world that I have, which is often referred to by the term racial capitalism. Even that's a little misleading because it makes it sound like, well, now there's two things, there's race and there's capitalism, and the world is just those two things. But, I think there's power. There's power over your material circumstances. And there's various ways to answer the question of how this or that person ended up with power over their material circumstances. But once you've answered it, then you have something to use to understand the world, to understand how that person relates to the world, and to understand what's at stake for that person in a given interaction. And that doesn't become true. That doesn't become any more or less true because we're using race to think about power than if we were using class to think about power, than if we were using gender to think about power.
You write, and I'm going to read a lengthy and really excellent passage here. Quote, deference practices that serve attention-focused campaigns, e.g., we've read too many white men, let's now read some people of color, can fail on their own highly questionable terms. Attention to spokespeople from marginalized groups could, for example, direct attention from the need to change the social system that marginalizes them. Elites from marginalized groups can benefit from this arrangement in ways that are compatible with social progress. But treating group elites' interests as necessarily or even presumptively aligned with full group interests involves a political naivete we cannot afford. Such treatment of elite interests functions as a racial Reaganomics, a strategy reliant on fantasies about the exchange rate between the attention economy and the material economy. Perhaps the lucky few who get jobs finding the most culturally authentic and cosmetically radical description of the continuing carnage are really winning one for the culture. Then, after we in the chattering classes get the clout we deserve and secure the bag, its contents will eventually trickle down to the workers who clean up after our conferences, to slums of the global South's megacities, to its countryside, but probably not. What is the presumed exchange rate between the attention economy and the material economy here? Or is that relationship to the material economy even really thought about at all when these norms are created and enacted?
I think the distinction in the question is an important one. And from day to day, I feel like I waffle between different answers to that question. Some days I wake up and I think, people really do believe that if we diversify the syllabi, that if we consume media from people of the right backgrounds, people genuinely believe that the rest of the world is going to change. And they're not sure, or they're just not saying how, but there is a line, there is a trail that starts at reading Fanon and ends at the dismantling of racial capitalism. And other days I wake up and I just stare at that first thing that I just said, and I think, no one believes that. There are some people who trust that someone else has a more specific answer, or maybe trust that we will come up with a more specific answer, but nobody now thinks that we have one. And people are just content with, the short-term consequences that we can be sure of, in lieu of that larger social transformation. So it's enough that we listen to different people than we were listening to yesterday. It's enough that different people are famous, or that different people are empowered in this or that organizing space. That's enough. And there's a very, very cynical version of that. We could say, maybe the people who believe that just are the people who would be empowered, or maybe they have some weird parasocial relationship to the people who would be empowered. I try to shy away as much as I can from too much of the psychology, especially, when it would tempt me to say bad faith things, because I, whenever I get in that mode of thought, I go back to thinking about people like Helen. And, Helen's just one recent and convenient example. I've met 1,000 people of all the identity groups you could think of who just were very thoughtful people and very serious people, and meant everything they said from a social justice standpoint, who I respect, who I've trusted with my safety in organizing campaigns, who I've trusted with my labor. And so I just don't believe that there's people out there, I don't believe that the whole phenomenon is just reducible to people out there grifting. Like, that's just not what's happening. But nevertheless, there's a bunch of how questions that seems to me that people aren't asking. How do we get, or that people haven't come up with things that seem to me like good answers. How do we get from a redistribution of attention to solutions? Maybe I just demand different things out of answers to that question than other people do. I think that's plausible, but I think there's problems in this area.
It's complicated. A lot of people are no doubt sincere. Others are no doubt nervous about doing or saying the wrong thing. But are there also things we can learn about the interests of the institutions where these play out, where one can presume a little more bad faith or cynicism in universities or corporate America or the nonprofit industrial complex, or in liberal democratic politics, or in the case of Jess La Bambolera?
Yeah.
The flamboyant white Jewish academic who for years pretended she was Afro-Latina and was a bit of a notorious scold on precisely the sort of deference epistemology practices that you're critiquing.
Yeah. Whew. Yeah, I mean, there's definitely the bomboleros. There's definitely people who are in a clear-eyed way exploiting social norms. And, I don't have anything interesting to say about those people. We can't avoid the imprint of those people by switching to different norms. There's just people who don't believe in the moral project that norms are for, or who don't care, so those people are always going to, grifters don't grift. Like, you can't prevent at a population level, you can't prevent a few out of the 7 billion of us from just exploiting whatever norms are there. So I want to acknowledge that, but then leave them aside. What do you say about the other people and these institutional formations that you're pointing out are actually a good reason to keep moving away from the grifter model of explaining what's happening in social justice spaces? Take the institution of the university, which I obviously participate in and so have some experience with. And if you think about the reward structure, the incentive structure, and I think just as importantly, the punishment structure of universities, you can start to tell a story about why these sorts of things take hold that doesn't at all invoke this whole cynical grifter kind of scenario. What do you get rewarded for in the academy? Especially in the parts of the academy where these sorts of norms circulate. You get rewarded for thinking of the new name for a thing. That's how you get people to cite your paper. You get rewarded for your description of a phenomenon. Sometimes the evaluation is aesthetic. Sometimes it's social. Does the in-crowd in your discipline view that as a helpful elaboration of something someone has said? Does it help them acquire prestige? If you look at these political forces, you're looking at the things that train academics to engage with social issues in the academy in the way that they do. And because the academy takes up so much of our thought and consciousness, because for a lot of us who are in the academy, it's an outsized proportion of our engagement with the issues that we think of. For some of us, it's our entire engagement with the issues that we think of. Then it's training us, it's creating our politics. And this is a point Nick Mitchell raises in Spectre in Nick's review of Frank Wilderson's book, Afro-Pessimism. This takes place in an institutional context, and that institutional context can tell us a lot about why people say and do the things that they say and do. And so I don't think it's that people are being dishonest. I think people are honestly engaging in politics in a way that makes sense where they are. Again, this just is the inside of standpoint epistemology. How you are socially situated affects what you know. And it just turns out that socially situated doesn't just mean your identity group, but it means the actual material circumstances, the incentives. It means where you stand in social life. And the academy is a place to stand in social life. And if you look at what the academy is like and what it rewards, then you'll see the kinds of things that point towards deference epistemology.
All that said, is it still better to intentionally have more women, more Black people, more Latinos on academic panels, in published books, on TV, and let's say on podcasts?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, when when the point's put squarely to me like that, then the question to me becomes, why not? Right? Like, our research projects should reflect the fact that in general, different people who are situated differently know different things. And I think much more importantly, there just wasn't a reason for the exclusion of these people in the first place, right? There wasn't a reason that intellectual life should have been cis white male dominated. And so there's no reason to carry forward yesterday's apartheid into how we do tomorrow's academy or tomorrow's entertainment industry or tomorrow's whatever it is that we're talking about. And because there's inertia in social and political systems, we might have to actually put effort in to undo the demographic imprint of yesterday's apartheid. And so, sure, diversify the syllabi. Sure, diversify the podcast hosts. Whatever. Just don't confuse that project with the project of racial justice, with the project of anti-capitalism, with the project of fixing the most serious things that are broken about society. Because there's no guaranteed relationship, perhaps no relationship at all, between those two goals.
We started by talking about how you, in a sense, got, and I presume frequently get, misrecognized as a different sort of Black man than you are. But of course, it's not just identity politics or deference epistemology that does that. American racism has made racial categories that are nonetheless in so many ways very much real, precisely because people, including the police, see someone like you as Black. Full stop. As Du Bois famously said, quote, "The Black man is a person who must ride Jim Crow in Georgia." Or as I heard recently on a podcast about immigration in southern New England, that's really good, called Mosaic. Someone said this in reference to New England's Cape Verdean community, quote, "The Cape Verdean from Pawtucket understands that he or she is Black when their hands are on the hood of the police car." How does the practice of deference epistemology that you're assessing, how does that fit into how this issue of how racism makes race, along the lines of what the Field sisters are talking about when they write about racecraft? That given that racism imposes its racial categories upon everyone, whether one likes it or not, that's kind of the point. We can't wave race away as an illusion, but we also shouldn't, as you emphasize, operate within its like naturalized confines. How do you navigate that tension?
Yeah, that tension is tough because, on the one hand, in a deep way, that's what race is, right? When people were abducted and put on slave ships and enslaved, they were Yoruba, they were Hausa, they were Fulani, they were whatever they were. They had their own political ecology, they had their own history, they had their own social basis for deciding who they were and what that meant, and a whole different set of struggles around trying to renegotiate those things or trying to maintain those things. And they were taken over to a part of the world that wanted to impose different ones, different identities. You're no longer Hausa, now you are Black. That's what's important about you. That's what's true about you. And so what's being brought up here is just what social categories even are from the perspective of politics and from the perspective of power. And so what I'm saying is less, that these categories are illusory, and more that we need to take stock of what challenges to those categories, and much more importantly, the forms of injustice that circulate them and that create them and that sustain them. We need to be a little more serious about what challenges to those mean, because those people are in rooms too, and they don't tend to be in the rooms that can be seriously challenged by deference epistemology. And this is a point that I think circles back to your earlier question about the focus on conversation and the focus on discourse and the focus on attention. If the primary things that are creating race and racism, to use your example, are what the police are doing, whether they're whether they're stopping and frisking people or whatever else, what other forms of harassment and violence it might be, if it's what the banks are doing in terms of who they deem creditworthy and where investment goes, if it's what the welfare offices are doing. So if it turns out that the things that most support the systems of racial oppression and gender oppression are being planned in different rooms than the rooms that we're debating conversational etiquette in, and if our conversational etiquette doesn't challenge those basic things, doesn't prevent the police from stopping and harassing and behaving violently towards Cape Verdeans, doesn't prevent the bankers from denying loans on the basis of race, doesn't prevent intimate partner violence, doesn't prevent the construction of inaccessible housing, then we put our focus in the wrong place. And if we don't have a story about how we're going to challenge those deeper practices by way of these smaller practices, then I have to question what the focus on these smaller practices is for.
An example along the lines of policing that comes to mind is the most famous one from the pre-Black Lives Matter Obama administration, which was Henry Louis Gates Jr. being interpolated in a very reductive way as black when he's arrested by that Cambridge cop. But then his experience ends with the beer summit at the White House, which is not the standard outcome of such an interaction with police.
Yeah, I think that's a really good example, right? And you can imagine, what did the police officer and Skip Gates and Obama discuss at this beer summit? And did they hear?
Biden was there too with a non-alcoholic beer.
Well,
I recall.
of course he was. And I'm sure they all shared the mic. I'm sure they all heard each other's perspectives. And I'm sure that nothing changed as a result of it. To what extent does it matter how that conversation went? And that's a conversation that includes some of the most powerful people in the world. A very powerful academic and, the so-called leader of the free world, the president of this large imperial country that sits atop the global order. If their conversation didn't matter, substantively speaking, what are we going to challenge by way of our conversations? And again, that's not to say that conversations are irrelevant. That's not to say that it doesn't matter how we talk to each other. We just need to be clear on what we can achieve by changing how we talk to each other.
Your critique has been on my mind all week as I've been reading coverage of Biden's appointments, where the issue of race and gender representation has really kind of been competing with attention to appointees' ideology for space in the newspaper. And I think overall that the question of race and gender representation has won out pretty decisively in terms of what matters about these appointees, as though ideology is somehow unrelated to racial or gender justice, when in fact ideology is what a given appointee thinks U.S. foreign policy should be towards Palestinians, or what criminal justice policy should look like for mass incarcerated Americans, or if the economy might be remade to empower women who are forced to work a double shift at work and then at home. What do you make of these dynamics where it's not just in activist spaces or in academia, but where really at the highest echelons of empire and capital in the carceral state, you see deference epistemology marshaled to actually defend or deflect attention away from incredibly racist and oppressive and violent institutions and politics?
I mean, in that case, if we're talking about what very powerful elected officials and formal political types are up to, then I think you really do need to bring back out the cynical grifter story that we set aside. Like, does anyone, here I fully embrace my cynical side. I just don't believe that anyone genuinely believes that it matters that Gina Haspel runs our black sites as opposed to a cis man or something. I find me a person who argues that, and I'll find you a liar, right? There's not anything else to say about those people. It's entirely cynical appropriation and co-option of kinds of thoughts that often travel in tandem with standpoint epistemology. I'm sure standpoint epistemologists, maybe not all of them down to a person, obviously, but it would be my guess that that's the prevailing view among standpoint epistemologists. And I think we should, let those people be disingenuous, but worry about what we believe.
Perhaps the most prominent recent distillation of deference epistemology has been the liberal call on Twitter and elsewhere to listen to black women. But it often turns out, upon closer inspection, that there's a rather selective group of black women who liberals believe are appropriate spokespeople for black women as a group. Does the operation of deference epistemology within elite spaces not only privilege elite speakers within elite spaces, but does it also confer on elites, including white elites, the power to choose who gets to represent oppressed groups?
I think the ability to decide who you defer to in strategic ways, I think clearly in a direct sense kind of cheapens what deference is, right? If you just ignore the people of the identity group that don't agree with the perspective that you've already developed, then all you've really gained is the ability to use someone else's identity as a smokescreen for your own politics. And I think that falls under the heading of what I described as moral cowardice at some point in the essay. But I think what is also interesting about that in the US context, most likely in other contexts, but I'm just speaking to what I have more experience of. What's particularly interesting about that is the way that it kind of weaponizes the US's own history of segregation and its imprint on passage to elite spaces. I imagine the white liberal, whether they're earnest or not, whether they're honest or not, whether they're cynical or not, I imagine that person must hear a very different thing by believe black women than I do. I just imagine that must play a different role in their life, because for most people in this country, particularly of affluent white backgrounds, their friend groups and social groups aren't that diverse. There was a study around this a while back. I can't off the top of my head recall the numbers, but there was a very small number of direct social connections to black people among the modal white American. And so for a number of these people, the only contact to political perspectives on the relevant issues that they might have might just be the person trotted in front of them as a black woman with a perspective on this issue.
The person on MSNBC, let's say.
Exactly, right? It's just listen to black women, just more or less just means listen to Joy Reid for them, because that's the person whose ideas that they're going to have any real kind of exposure to. Whereas, someone with a different background, I grew up around many, many black people. There's many black women whose perspectives I'm familiar with on this issue or that issue. My academic training involved connection to people. And so there's a range of perspectives I might have access to and could think about when someone says to me, believe black women. Right. So I don't know what the intended social impact of that phrase is supposed to be. But that's the social environment it interacts with. I think that works out well for you if you're Joy Reid. I don't know how well it works for working class Black women who aren't on TV. Maybe, maybe it does work well. I don't know. But yeah.
That's a really important point. But some of this deference epistemology, the listen to or center or follow Black women sort in particular, really thrives within our segregated society. Because if one knows a decent number of Black people or Latino people or whatever, one would realize that Black women or Latino people or whatever group have an incredible diversity of opinions on pretty much anything, like any human being.
It's hard not to read. I don't want to pick on that particular slogan in general. I mean, for a number of reasons, one of which is, because it means a different thing among Black people, it's a much more defensible thing to say if you're talking to Black people, I think, or at least a different kind of thing to say. Then it seems like it's a criticism of patriarchy and a phenomenon of not taking women seriously in our own spaces. And that's a much different statement than telling the white liberal to listen to Joy Reid, in effect. But in a way, that's one of the hard things about social media, that it's so hard to tie down a message to a particular context because messages circulate in different ways than they would without that technology.
This is Sarah Jaffe, and you are listening to The Dig with Daniel Denver, my favorite podcast for thoughtful discussions on the U.S. left and beyond, and you can support it on patreon.com.
This episode of The Dig is brought to you by our listeners who support us at patreon.com and by Haymarket Books, which has loads of great left-wing titles, perfect for Dig listeners like you. One that you might like is Palestine, A Socialist Introduction, edited by Sumaya Awad and Brian Bean. Palestine, A Socialist Introduction systematically tackles a number of important aspects of the Palestinian struggle for liberation, contextualizing it in an increasingly polarized world and offering a socialist perspective on how full liberation can be won. Through an internationalist, anti-imperialist lens, this book explores the links between the struggle for freedom in the United States and that in Palestine and beyond. It examines both the historical and contemporary trajectory of the Palestine solidarity movement in order to glean lessons for today's organizers, and compellingly lays out the argument that, in order to achieve justice in Palestine, the movement has to take up the question of socialism, regionally and internationally. As Noura Erakat says of the book, quote, "The volume provides the reader with an internationalist framework defined as a commitment to anti-imperialism and uses it to place Palestine into local, regional, and global historical context. The book connects the past to our present and, despite the daunting odds before us, sustains a commitment to a socialist future where all of us are free because all of us are free." Palestine, A Socialist Introduction, edited by Sumaya Awad and Brian Bean, out now from Haymarket Books. We have this dynamic where we have seen a Black president and now a Black woman vice president, but we have not seen the end or really any meaningful curbing of residential and educational segregation or mass incarceration or so many other problems that in our racist capitalist system are characteristic of many Black people's experience in this country. And this contradiction between the promise of a Black president and the persistent injustices of Black reality has often, I think correctly, been seen as the context within which Black Lives Matter first erupted. To what degree do you see present-day Black radical politics as addressing or grappling with this issue of deference epistemology, if not in those terms that you're writing about?
That's interesting. That's an interesting way of framing the most recent years of Black radical struggle. It just seems to me that, especially when politicians are concerned, that Black activists in the US have been, I think, very clear-eyed about what Black leadership does and does not mean, particularly in the most recent decade or so. I think the uprising in Baltimore, I think the ongoing campaign, BLMLA, for example, had been protesting a Black DA, Jackie Lacey, for years. That campaign had been going. I think that there's an understanding among movement people that there isn't a guarantee of how people will protect your interests based on what their identity is. And I think what's most interesting to me about that is how that has failed to inform the kind of commentary in other spaces on the issues that these movements are talking about. I think it's pretty apparent from those kinds of contexts. I think it was probably apparent to people in Flint or Baltimore that what was at issue was how people were treated, and that racism had everything to do with that, but that beating back structural racism was more than just having Black faces in high places. And I think that sort of thing was clear along other identity dimensions as well. And I think working back from that to a broader view of what identity means and what it doesn't mean, I think is the sort of thing that the essay was about.
Deference epistemology can also facilitate really bad organizational vibes and dynamics in terms of political organizations in particular. And in particular, and you touch on this rather carefully, it can also empower troubled personalities who destabilize groups and can undermine their political project. You write, quote, "In Conflict is Not Abuse, Sarah Schulman makes a provocative observation about the psychological effects of both trauma and felt superiority. While these often come about for different reasons and have very different moral statuses, they result in similar behavioral patterns. Chief among these are misrepresenting the stakes of the conflict, often by overstating harm, or representing others' independence as a hostile threat, such as failures to center the right topics or people. These behaviors, whatever their causal history, have corrosive effects on individuals who perform them, as well as the groups around them, especially when a community's norms magnify or multiply these behaviors rather than constraining or metabolizing them." This is a powerful passage that I know will resonate with many listening. My question is, how does that operate? How does deference epistemology do these two related things, both transforming political disagreements into unforgivable wrongs, and also creating these group norms that protect such behavior against criticism by calling such criticism, say, tone policing?
There are forms of sanction that protect this, like the accusation of tone policing, for example. But I think the deeper thing that's going on is just deference itself. I'm confident that if you had social norms where what things people said, whether they were about harm or about offense or about trauma, were evaluated, then I think that by itself would produce a very different social environment than deference epistemology. Because at the end of the day, deference epistemology tells you not to evaluate certain things in certain situations. And I think the potential of that for particularly egregious kinds of exploitation are just obvious as soon as you've described it, right? Like if you defer if you say, well, this person's perspective is what we're going with, kind of regardless of what I privately feel. I think you're going to encourage very recognizable forms of abuse, very recognizable forms of bullying. And part of the reason why I was so oblique about this and why I'm still being so oblique about this is just because I'm confident that people will recognize this phenomenon. And the point isn't to demonize people who behave in a certain way or who have dealt with certain kinds of psychological problems. My point is just to point out the role of norms in making those things worse rather than helping.
And it's also obviously not to say that people don't suffer or that we shouldn't pay attention to trauma and take it seriously. You write, quote, "I take concerns about trauma especially seriously. I grew up in the United States, a nation structured by settler colonialism, racial slavery, and their aftermath, with enough collective and historical trauma to go round. I also grew up in a Nigerian diasporic community, populated by many who had genocide in living memory. At the national and community level, I have seen a lot of traits of norms, personality, quirks of habit and action that I've suspected were downstream of these facts. At the level of individual experience, I've watched and felt myself change in reaction to fearing for my dignity or life, to crushing pain and humiliation. I reflect on these traumatic moments often, and very seldom think, that was educational. Contra the old expression, pain, whether born of oppression or not, is a poor teacher. Suffering is partial, short-sighted, and self-absorbed. We shouldn't have a politics that expects different. Oppression is not a prep school." How does deference epistemology rely upon this conveying of a sort of pedagogical and epistemic status upon suffering and trauma? And why, contrary to conventional wisdom, is that neither accurate nor helpful?
I think one of the things I've found most alienating about this phenomenon that I'm describing is deference epistemology is the attitude towards trauma and suffering that's typically involved. And this section of the essay was my attempt to say why, but it's just, I introduced this section by saying that what I have to say in the section where I talk about trauma is more conviction than contention or something like that, more conviction than traditional argument or something. But it's the furthest thing from how I've experienced the world that trauma is educational. And I don't think I'm alone. Unfortunately, the world contains the depths of violence and despair where we could test this theory out. You could go to places post-genocide. You could go to places post-ethnic cleansing, and you could see how character building of an experience trauma was. I don't understand the reverence that trauma holds in some political corners. That's not what it means to me. That's not what it seemed to mean to the other people around me growing up. And I don't see the things that come out of treating trauma this way in a positive light, as the essay as a whole is kind of a long attempt to say. And so I think the deference epistemology, in the fact that it often kind of legitimates itself by invoking the language of trauma or the experience of it, that deference epistemology often takes it that oppressed people have, and the insight that the strategy seems to assume that it grants you. I just think that it just strikes me as a thoroughly fictional relationship to reality, to suffering, and much deeper than anything else I said in the essay. I just have no desire to participate in it. and I won't.
And the status is accorded automatically because you draw this distinction between the raw experience of trauma, which, as you write, is a poor teacher, and on the other, the process of drawing political wisdom from trauma, which is something that always, you write, requires consciousness raising. And I think that consciousness raising, in turn, seems like it requires what we might call organizing. This ideological and psychological transformation that can occur, that I've seen occur in many people when people organize with others, a process of coming to a personal and a politically contextualized personal knowledge through being in a sort of socio-political relationship with other people.
Yeah, it's work. And it's a lot of work. And one of the reasons why it's a lot of work is because trauma is actually, in the default, bad for you. That's part of why we don't want to experience it. Right? It's not like exercise where feeling the burn is constructive in the default case. Like, actually, trauma is a thing that mostly messes you up. And it's a testament to the work and effort and struggles of the feminist movement and of labor movements and of people that have got out and made something other than more suffering out of the trauma that people were experiencing. It's a testament to the work that those people did, both the organizers and the people being organized with, that people have made radical intellectual traditions and that people have made whole cultural practices out of trauma that encoded something like knowledge, that encoded things like insight. It's a testament to the work that they did. It's not some automatic crown that you get for suffering. It was built, and it was built intentionally. And it could be built intentionally because people recognized that they had to build it and that it wasn't there already.
Yeah, this made me think about the work that my friend and comrade political scientist Mia Inoue is doing. She's writing about organizing and how a basic problem for organizers is how to help people overcome incapacitation. Oppression, yes, does give people knowledge of their own suffering, but it also undermines people's sense of their own political efficacy and undermines their opportunity to develop political skills. And like you say, oppression is not a prep school. And so organizing at its most basic level aims to change that. My question is, does deference epistemology then, in its treatment of trauma, which includes, as you write, this, quote, hyper-sanitized and thoroughly fictional caricature of oppressed people, is one of the core problems with it really that it undermines the very philosophy that must guide the actual practice of organizing?
Yeah, it's the combination of the fact that it invites us to look away from the disadvantages that come with oppression and trauma, which undermines the practical things we would have to do to address those and to respond to those. And not only does it look away from those things, but I think on a certain kind of interpretation, it lies about them. It tells you that it doesn't matter that people don't have labs or research time to decide whether the Mission Department of Environmental Quality, or to be able to prove, I should say, that the Mission Department of Environmental Quality is lying about the quality of the water. It tells you that those things don't matter. It tells you that it doesn't matter that people don't have any organized body that can organize a strike, for example. It only calls attention to this supposed advantage of knowledge and does so in a way that assumes either the non-existence or irrelevance of all these other material disadvantages that we could be making it our business to try to intervene in. And so organizing in response to exactly the sorts of things that motivated standpoint epistemology in the first place, I think would have to start by telling the truth that those disadvantages matter. And to the extent that we can intervene in those disadvantages, to the extent that we can do some power building around those other forms of disadvantage that are bundled with general oppression. So what's important to me about the alternative that I call the constructive view is that starts from what I think we have to start with, which is telling the truth about the full set of advantages and disadvantages that all are at play and that all matter. Yes, experiencing oppression and trauma can give you insight and information that you can't get anyhow else. But that's not the only thing that matters. It matters whether or not you have access to be able to produce knowledge with other people and to produce proof with other people, to use the example of the Flint residents that's referenced in the essay. It matters whether or not you have people who have the time to find things out and to communicate those things. It matters whether or not you have the worker organization to be able to convert knowing that something is wrong to being able to hold a strike, for example, and challenge that thing that is wrong. All these other material differences.
And believing that you have the power to challenge it.
Exactly, right? And believing that you have the power to challenge it, and having the evidence that you have the power to challenge it, and having the resources to make that true. And until we tell the truth about those things, I think these points about the potential epistemic benefits of trauma and oppression ring hollow to me, seem like mistakes.
I'm also thinking that not only does deference epistemology undermine organizing, but also the other way around, that our disorganized society facilitates the spread of deference epistemology, because your essay brings up this question about what individuals or entities can speak for larger groups with whom they're associated. Are individuals considered representative of groups because they share a common trait like race or gender? Or are they representative of groups because they have some relational bond of representation through an organized group? What I'm thinking about is like a slippage between two different but related definitions of the word representative. Like A, representative meaning a person chosen or appointed to speak on behalf of or act on behalf of others. And then B, representative meaning someone who is somehow typical of a group. And to me, this treatment of individuals, of certain individuals in elite spaces as automatically representative of larger social groups, it seems connected to this broader problem of representation in an era of massive and systematic disorganization. There's like a vacuum in substantive representation of organized collectivities. And I think that's because there's a major lack of popular organization in our society. And so without concrete social and political organization within which kind of deeper forms of representation can be rooted through social and political relationships, individuals get treated as automatically representative of abstract social groups. And you emphasize elite capture, which I think is important. But I think there's another deep factor at play here, perhaps, which is the notion that an individual can represent automatically some imagined collectivity in the absence of any organizational, representational relationship to that collectivity.
So yeah, I think that deorganization of society makes the kind of elite capture that you were describing possible. And so I kind of organize it in my head under the heading elite capture, but there's obviously lots of ways you could think about it. But what it seems to me that's happening is decades ago, if you wanted to weigh in on an issue that had to do with a group, and that group was represented by organizations, you might think twice about it. Because as a spokesperson or as a kind of self-proclaimed spokesperson, you would have to answer to an organized group of other people. That organization created spaces where people could develop their own views on the topic and develop confidence in those views, both of which are important. It would also develop relationships of accountability So if you were a visible member of those organizations, like Dr. King was, for example, for the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, or as Malcolm X was for the Nation of Islam for a while, if you had a perspective on the issues those groups are organizing around and you talked without authorization, there might be a whole group of people that would have something to say to you the next time you went home, or the next time you saw them at the grocery store, the next time you saw them in community. You would talk different, right? You would have more of a pause. And just as importantly, if you contradicted something that they said, then they would have ways of getting out a contradictory message to yours. They would have groups where that contradictory message could be discussed. They might have newspapers or pamphlets to get out the message contradicting yours. And so even if you were bold enough to ignore those relationships of accountability, even if you were confident enough in your views not to mind that you might run into a bunch of people from these organizations that said, hey, this is not the way to represent our group, you might just be out-organized by them on a messaging standpoint. That's not true now. Now we have big tech corporations that have essentially asserted ownership over the hugely socially important aspects of knowledge distribution.
The digital commons were sort of born and closed as far as most of us are concerned.
Right. And so if Mark Zuckerberg owns the attention economy rather than Marcus Garvey, then there's going to be different rules about who can say what about the topic of racial justice. There's going to be different rules about who can say what about the topic of disability justice. And there's going to be different decisions made in terms of how those things circulate. And those decisions are increasingly made by EdgeRank or whatever other AI social algorithm, and not made by us at all, much less those of us who have justice in mind.
You have so many powerful passages, and this is really, honestly, one of the most important essays I can recall reading. And I will include a link to it in the show notes so that everyone who has not already read it can do so. So many powerful passages. One that really hit home was your analysis of how deference epistemology can make white people, or others deemed privileged, into pretty crappy comrades. You write, quote, "For those who defer, the habit can supercharge moral cowardice. The norms provide social cover for the abdication of responsibility. It places onto individual heroes, a hero class, or a mythicized past, the work that is ours to do now in the present. Their perspective may be clearer on this or that specific matter, but their overall point of view isn't any less particular or constrained by history than ours. More importantly, deference places the accountability that is all of ours to bear onto select people, and, more often than not, a hyper-sanitized and thoroughly fictional caricature of them." This really hit home. I know of situations where white people, perhaps with the encouragement of a lonely person of color in the room, concluded that the room was not optimally representative, and so decided or proposed that the most socially justice thing they could do was nothing, which is often explained in the terminology of stepping back. What sort of comrades does this dynamic turn white people or others seen to be privileged into? And how does that, in turn, rely on this romantic, kind of like noble savage caricature of the other?
I use the term cowardice in the essay. I wanted to make the point as forcefully as I could, but I think it's also important to keep track of the fact that two things are being kind of weaponized by these norms. One being insecurity. So why expose yourself to the kind of social sanction that might come from contradicting someone who's perceived to be someone you ought to defer to? it would take quite a bit of self-confidence or conviction, depending on the situation, depending on the room. So that's insecurity. But it also exploits trust. So especially, I remember being in a lot of organizing spaces where there were new people who didn't have a lot of experience with social justice or activist culture, and who just kind of saw everyone else doing these strange deference epistemology things. And they had to make a decision, right? Do they regard themselves as the sort of person who can evaluate these, right? As the person who just got in the room? Everyone says, the experienced activists say, if there are no people of color here, then we do nothing. I just got here. What do I do? And, I think the point is especially sharp if we're thinking about the people who might be new in these spaces. But the fact remains that trust is a part of what's going on here. And I don't want to make it sound like it's just people who are unwilling to stick to their guns, who are cowards, who this applies to. But either way, I think like what's going on in your question stands. The kind of people that are produced by these messages are the kind of people that we're training not to stand up to power. And I think the most convenient version of the case for deference epistemology, we have to think that we're very selectively training people to stand up to power. The same people that we want to be bold enough to confront the cops, to, in the final analysis, confront the bosses and to confront the military. We want them to be lions in the streets and lambs in the organizing rooms. And maybe this works. People are capable of compartmentalizing. I don't know. But I would never ask someone, at this point, I guess I just have to speak for myself. I would never ask someone to do that. I would never ask someone to put themselves in harm's way with me, and sometimes even for me, who I don't respect enough to hear out respectful disagreement with. And I don't understand why we have that expectation for anyone else. And again, here I think is another point where I have to say the thing that I said before, where it's just, I throw up my hands. I just won't do it. This is something I won't participate in. And in a way, you can only get so far with argument and reasoning. I'm just not on this team. And if I ask someone to do the kinds of things, to take the kinds of risks, to do the kind of work that activism requires, the very minimum I feel like I owe them in return is to treat them as a person and not as someone who not as a subject that I order around or, demand that they bend the knee to me.
You write, quote, I think about James Baldwin's realization that the things that tormented him the most were the very things that connected me with all the people who were alive, who had ever been alive. That I have survived abuse of various kinds, have faced near death from both accidental circumstance and violence, different as the particulars of these may be from those around me, is not a card to play in gamified social interaction, or a weapon to wield in battles over prestige. It is not what gives me a special right to speak, to evaluate, or to decide for a group. It is a concrete experiential manifestation of the vulnerability that connects me to most of the people on this earth. It comes between me and other people not as a wall, but as a bridge. With deference epistemology, it's not just what people know because of who they are, but what other people cannot know because of who they are and who they are not. Where does this commonplace notion of, I don't know the correct philosophical term for it, so I'm going to try out radical epistemological alterity, where does that fit into your analysis? And why should we instead think of experience as a bridge rather than a wall?
So one of the core points that I'm making here kind of calls back something that I said earlier. A point that came up earlier in the essay was that as identities become more and more fine-grained and disagreements sharper, we come to realize that coalitional politics, understood as struggle across difference, is simply politics. And thus, the deferential orientation is ultimately anti-political. And basically the thought that I was saying there, and that I'm also coming back to at the end, is that, roughly speaking, there's a couple ways that we could treat the importance of experience, and that we could treat the importance of particularly important experiences like trauma and pain and suffering and the experience of oppression. These are things that can cleave us apart from one another, or they can do the opposite. And Baldwin, in particular, seems to me like someone who understood that in the most deep way that I think it can be understood. I think from a very young age, he saw himself as trying to figure out why other people were doing the things that they were doing. Whether you agree or not with what the people around you are doing, you can kind of see them as obstacles in the way of your self-actualization, or you can see yourself as trying to live with them in a different way than you're living with them now. And I think what I was trying to say at the end there is that there's something in it for us beyond the fact that I think it's just a better description of people as their own fully fledged human beings with their own pain, with lives as serious to them as mine is to me. But beyond the fact that that's just, I think, true about the world and about other people, and that that's the way that you have to look at the world to get things right, I just think there's something in it for us if we look at other people this way, and if we adopt the view of ourselves that goes along with looking at other people this way. And, to put it quickly, I think it's the basis for solidarity. Like, this is where it comes from. It's not sameness, right? It's not the idea that we've been through the same things, or that we want the same things, or that we have the same ideas. It's a much more fundamental commonality that we all need each other. And we all are in the situation where we're trying to deal with this huge thing, the world, our social structure in the world, these things that exceed us, that are bigger than us, that are larger than us, that were here before us, that will be here after us, that we can't possibly hope to fix on our own terms, with our own hands, with our own power. And that commonality can be enough if we have the right relationship to it, and if we have the right relationship to ourselves. If we look at our differences as potential resources rather than, walls, as I put it there. And, I don't know, I say it out loud. I feel like a fucking kumbaya hippie type person, but it's, I believe it. I'm trying to be honest about that, and I'm trying to not shy away from saying the thing I think is true. That's the thing I think is true. And that's the thing I think is helpful, and that's the thing I think is useful.
You close your essay with a really interesting argument about what standpoint epistemology looks like when it is actually put into practice, instead of deference epistemology being put into practice. A quote, focus on building and rebuilding rooms, not regulating traffic within and between them. To be accountable and responsive to people who aren't yet in the room. To build the kinds of rooms we could sit in together, rather than merely judiciously navigating the rooms history has built for us. And you point to the struggle launched by residents of Flint, Michigan, in alliance with scientists to expose their city's contaminated drinking water and to get clean water instead. You write, quote, they didn't need their oppression to be celebrated, centered, or narrated in the newest academic parlance. They didn't need someone to understand what it felt like to be poisoned. What they needed was the lead out of their water. So they got to work. But you do write that establishing epistemic authority, that was their first step. Explain this argument and why what you describe as actual standpoint epistemology in practice, why that requires this orientation to concrete, practical, strategic political action in the world.
Yeah, so there were a few things going on there. One is that epistemic authority was required, but they were using it, right? So epistemic authority wasn't itself the goal. It wasn't the thing that they were organizing their lives around. It was a way of getting what their goal was, which was clean water. So that's one kind of difference from at least the sort of moralizing ways of thinking about deference epistemology, where it's just we're trying to fix complicity with oppressive structures, and that's why you have to defer to this person or that person to be morally right with justice, I guess, in a way that's insensitive to the actual practical consequences. So one part of what's going on was that epistemic authority was part of a political project and an instrumental part of the political project as opposed to being its own goal. And second, I think what's going on there is that the people were, from what I can tell from the outside as an outsider, right? I very well might have a different perspective than people who know more. But what it seems to me is that people were very clear-eyed about what their objective was. And being clear-eyed about their objective, their material objective, made them make different decisions about what kinds of knowledge they needed to develop. So people, especially in the academy, make a big deal about the fact that environmental racism was at play in Flint, Michigan, and I have no disagreement with them. I think that's right. But we should notice that people went and found scientists that had the labs that could prove what the Michigan Department of Environmental Quality was saying to be fraudulent. They didn't go to the humanities departments or the cultural studies departments to find a new fancy reading of Fanon or Du Bois or whoever the fuck, and then present that. That was not what they needed, and so that's not what they did. Right? And I think the lesson from that is, if these things that keep us up at night, how to read paragraph 7 of page 42 of this or that particular radical thinker in this or that tradition, if these things are so fucking important, then tell me the full story of what we get on the other side of those questions, right? And, that's not to say we shouldn't do those things. I'm an academic. I'm a nerd like everybody else. I just want to know stuff to know it. That's fine. But if we want to contribute, right, if we really think of ourselves as part of these movements or as trying to at least help, trying to be relevant, we should learn about knowledge and think about knowledge on the ways that they demonstrate. And they started with a practical objective and figured out what knowledge was relevant to achieving it and figured out how to get it. If they can figure that out, the people that lived in Flint at the time, why can't the rest of us? Right? I think we should take a page from that book in general. We should figure out what knowledge is needed that isn't there, or what knowledge needs to circulate that maybe is somewhere, but that needs to get from where it is to somewhere else. And we should try to figure out the practical projects that knowledge acquisition can fit into, rather than having these debates for debate's sake. And this goes back to something we discussed at the beginning, which is just the institutions that produce knowledge don't reward this. They either incentivize us to produce knowledge that people in power can use, as opposed to knowledge that can be used against them, or they incentivize us not to produce knowledge at all, or at least not knowledge that's politically relevant. This is true regardless of the pretensions of the people producing knowledge. Some of these people say nothing about politics. Some of these people say a lot about politics, but what it comes down to is what gets used and what's usable. And as soon as we start to think about knowledge production on those terms, I think we'll come up with better ideas about how to be in these institutions, whether it's the newsroom, whether it's the think tank, whether it's the policy office of this or that elected official, whether it's the union research groups, whatever it is. I mean, I suspect union researchers don't need our help with this, but you see what I'm saying? The people who are producing knowledge should be thinking about this kind of thing rather than deference politics.
Femi Táíwò, thanks so much.
Thank you.
Femi Táíwò is a professor of philosophy at Georgetown University. His work focuses on social and political philosophy, with an emphasis on anti-colonial thought and the Black radical tradition. Thank you for listening to The Dig from Jacobin Magazine. As Marx once said, after noting that the phantoms formed in the human brain are also, necessarily, sublimates of their material life process, which is empirically verifiable and bound to material premises. While other podcasts have only interpreted the world in various ways, our point is to change it. We are posting new episodes every week. The Dig was produced by Alex Lewis, music by Jeffrey Brodsky. Our communications coordinators are Julia Rock and Zachary Nin. Our senior advisor is Thea Riofrancos. Many thanks to all of you for making 4 years of The Dig possible. I really, really appreciate it. Check out The Dig's vast archives at thedigradio.com. Follow us on Twitter at thedigradio, same on Facebook. And please find us wherever you get podcasts and subscribe. If it's on iTunes or wherever, please also leave us a nice rating and review. Those help introduce us to new listeners. But what really and truly does that is you telling other people why you like the show, why they'll like the show. For our 4-year anniversary, please take the opportunity to post to Twitter, Facebook, wherever, a note about what The Dig means to you, why you listen, why others should too. Please make propaganda for us. And do find us at patreon.com and make a monthly contribution to keep this operation up and running. Even a few bucks is huge.